subscribe to my channel. Thank you.
Welcome to our AWS Lambda interview questions and answers session. If you're looking to ace your AWS interview or enhance your knowledge of serverless computing, you're in the right place. In this video, we'll explore the ins and outs of AWS Lambda, covering everything from best practices to performance optimization. Get ready to level up your AWS skills and gain the confidence to excel in your interviews. Let's dive in. This is the part 1. What is AWS Lambda and how does it work? AWS Lambda is a serverless computing service provided by Amazon Web Services (AWS). It allows you to run code in response to events without the need to provision or manage servers. When an event triggers a Lambda function, AWS automatically provisions the required resources, runs the code, and then scales down the resources when the function execution is complete. Lambda functions can be triggered by various AWS services, example, S3, API Gateway, DynamoDB, or custom events. What are the key benefits of using AWS Lambda? Some key benefits of AWS Lambda include serverless, you don't need to manage server infrastructure. Scalability, automatically scales based on the number of incoming events. Cost-effective, you only pay for the compute time your code consumes. Easy integration with other AWS services. Supports multiple programming languages including Node.js, Python, Java, and more. How do you handle errors in AWS Lambda functions? You can handle errors in Lambda functions in the following ways. Logging. Use logging to capture error information and monitor function execution using CloudWatch logs. Dead letter queues (DLQs) configure a DLQ for Lambda functions to capture and analyze failed events. Retry mechanism. Implement retry logic for specific errors in your code. Custom error handling. Use try-catch blocks to catch and handle errors within your Lambda function code. What is the maximum execution time for an AWS Lambda function? The maximum execution time for a single AWS Lambda function is 900 seconds, 15 minutes. Can AWS Lambda functions be deployed in a VPC, virtual private cloud? Yes, AWS Lambda functions can be deployed within a VPC to access resources within that VPC, such as private databases or resources behind a firewall. You can configure a Lambda function to run inside a VPC and associate it with specific subnets and security groups. How can you pass environment variables to AWS Lambda functions? You can pass environment variables to AWS Lambda functions in the following ways. Set them directly in the AWS Lambda function configuration. Use AWS Systems Manager parameter store to store and manage environment variables. Pass environment variables in a deployment package, example, within a deployment package in a file. What are the different triggers for AWS Lambda functions? AWS Lambda functions can be triggered by various AWS services including Amazon S3 events, Amazon API Gateway requests, Amazon DynamoDB streams, AWS CloudWatch events, AWS SNS, Simple Notification Service notifications, custom HTTP requests using AWS API Gateway, and more. How does AWS Lambda pricing work? AWS Lambda pricing is based on the number of requests and the execution duration. You pay for the number of requests your functions process and the total duration of code execution measured in GB seconds. There is a free tier available and you only pay for what you use. What is the maximum memory allocation for an AWS Lambda function? The maximum memory allocation for an AWS Lambda function is 3008 megabytes, 3.008 gigabytes. How can you secure AWS Lambda functions? You can secure AWS Lambda functions by configuring appropriate IAM roles and permissions, using VPC for network isolation, encrypting data at rest and in transit, implementing proper authentication and authorization mechanisms in your code, enabling AWS Web Application Firewall (WF) and AWS Shield for DDoS protection if necessary. What is the deployment package of an AWS Lambda function and what are its size limits? The deployment package is a zip archive that contains your function code and any dependencies. The deployment package size limit for deployment directly in the AWS Management Console is 3 MB for inline code and 50 MB for code from an S3 bucket. For larger packages, you can use layers to manage dependencies and reduce the size of your deployment package. Can you schedule AWS Lambda functions to run at specific times? Yes, you can schedule AWS Lambda functions using Amazon CloudWatch events. You can create and configure rules in CloudWatch events to trigger Lambda functions at specific times or intervals, making it suitable for tasks like running backups or cleaning up resources. How does AWS Lambda handle concurrent executions? AWS Lambda automatically manages concurrency for you. Each function can be configured to have a specific amount of reserved concurrency. Additional concurrency is allocated as needed, up to the account level limit. If your function is processing a large number of events concurrently, AWS Lambda will automatically scale to handle the load. What is cold start in AWS Lambda and how can you mitigate it? Cold start refers to the initial time it takes to initialize a new execution environment for a Lambda function. You can mitigate cold starts by increasing the function's memory allocation as it affects CPU power, using provision concurrency to keep a specified number of instances warm, optimizing your code and dependencies to reduce initialization time. Explain the difference between synchronous and asynchronous invocation of Lambda functions. Synchronous invocation means that the function executes immediately in response to a trigger, and the caller waits for a response. Asynchronous invocation, on the other hand, means the function is triggered, but the caller doesn't wait for the result. The function returns a response to the caller when it's done. Asynchronous invocations are often used for event-driven processing. How do you control the order of execution for multiple AWS Lambda functions in a serverless application? You can use AWS step functions to create workflows that coordinate and control the order of execution for multiple Lambda functions. Step functions allow you to create complex, stateful workflows by specifying the order and conditions for function execution. Can you monitor the performance and errors of AWS Lambda functions? Yes, you can monitor Lambda functions using AWS CloudWatch. You can set up alarms, create custom metrics, and analyze logs to monitor performance and detect errors. AWS X-Ray can also be used for tracing and performance analysis. What is the maximum payload size that can be passed to an AWS Lambda function through an event source? The maximum payload size that can be passed to an AWS Lambda function through an event source varies depending on the service. For example, for an S3 event trigger, the maximum payload size is 256 kilobytes. How can you handle long-running tasks in AWS Lambda functions? AWS Lambda has a maximum execution time of 15 minutes. If you have long-running tasks, you can break them into smaller chunks and use services like AWS step functions to manage the workflow. Alternatively, you can use AWS Fargate or other services designed for longer executions. Explain the difference between AWS Lambda and AWS Fargate. AWS Lambda is a serverless compute service for running code in response to events, whereas AWS Fargate is a container orchestration service. Lambda is designed for short-lived, event-driven tasks, while Fargate is used for running containers within your own infrastructure. How can you ensure the security of environment variables in AWS Lambda functions? To ensure the security of environment variables in Lambda functions, you should use AWS Identity and Access Management (IAM) policies to control access to environment variables. Store sensitive data as encrypted secrets in AWS Secrets Manager or AWS Systems Manager Parameter Store. Avoid hard-coding sensitive information directly in your function code. What is the maximum timeout for an AWS Lambda function? The maximum timeout for an AWS Lambda function is 900 seconds, 15 minutes. Functions that run longer than this limit will be terminated. Can you use AWS Lambda to perform real-time data processing? Yes, AWS Lambda is suitable for real-time data processing when triggered by events. You can process incoming data and take actions in near real-time in response to events generated by other AWS services or custom event sources. Explain the concept of event sources in AWS Lambda. Event sources are AWS services or external triggers that invoke Lambda functions. These can include services like S3, API Gateway, DynamoDB, CloudWatch, SNS, and custom applications via HTTP endpoints. Event sources define when and how a Lambda function is executed. How can you handle dependencies in an AWS Lambda deployment package? You can package dependencies with your Lambda function in several ways. Including dependencies directly in your deployment package, example, including node.js node_modules. Using AWS Lambda layers to attach shared libraries to your function. Storing dependencies in an S3 bucket and referencing them in your code. What is the difference between provision concurrency and reserved concurrency in AWS Lambda? Provision concurrency allows you to pre-warm a specific number of function instances to ensure low latency. Reserved concurrency sets a minimum number of concurrent executions for a function. The key difference is that provision concurrency allows for scaling up and down, while reserved concurrency simply sets a minimum threshold. Can you use AWS Lambda for long polling or continuous processing of data streams? AWS Lambda is better suited for event-driven processing rather than long polling or continuous data stream processing. For such use cases, services like AWS Kinesis Data Streams, Amazon SQS, or AWS Fargate may be more appropriate. How can you handle versioning and aliases for AWS Lambda functions? You can use versioning and aliases to manage different versions of your Lambda functions. Each version is immutable and aliases provide a consistent way to invoke specific versions. This helps with safe deployments and testing. What is the difference between concurrent execution and concurrent invocation in AWS Lambda? Concurrent execution refers to the number of requests or events that a Lambda function can process simultaneously. Concurrent invocation refers to the total number of requests or events that are currently being processed across all instances of a Lambda function. How can you secure the communication between an AWS Lambda function and other AWS services? You can secure communication by using IAM rules to control permissions. Enabling encryption in transit, example, HTTPS, SSL. Enabling encryption at rest for data stored in AWS services. Configuring VPCs and security groups for network isolation when required. Can AWS Lambda functions trigger other Lambda functions? Yes, AWS Lambda functions can trigger other Lambda functions. You can create a chain or orchestration of functions by invoking one function from another using the AWS SDK or service triggers. What is the maximum allowed package size for an AWS Lambda deployment when you're using AWS SAM, Serverless Application Model? When using AWS SAM, the maximum package size is 50 megabytes, which is the same as when deploying directly to Lambda from an S3 bucket. How does AWS Lambda help in achieving auto-scalability? AWS Lambda achieves auto-scalability by automatically managing the number of instances running based on the volume of incoming events. It scales out to handle concurrent executions and scales and when there are no events to process, ensuring efficient resource utilization. What is the difference between an AWS Lambda trigger and an AWS Lambda destination? A trigger initiates the execution of a Lambda function in response to an event. In contrast, a destination is a configuration that allows you to send the results of a Lambda function's execution to another AWS service, example, S3, SNS, SQS, for further processing or analysis. How do you handle long-term state or data between Lambda function executions? AWS Lambda is designed for stateless, short-lived functions. To handle long-term state or data, you should use external storage solutions like Amazon S3, Amazon DynamoDB, or other databases to persist and retrieve data between function executions. Explain the concept of event source mapping in relation to AWS Lambda. Event source mapping is a feature used with services like Amazon SQS and Amazon DynamoDB streams. It allows you to associate a Lambda function with these event sources, enabling the function to process items from these streams as they become available. Can AWS Lambda functions be triggered by custom events generated by your application, such as a mobile app or web application? Yes, AWS Lambda functions can be triggered by custom events generated by your application through HTTP endpoints. You can create an API using AWS API Gateway and trigger Lambda functions via API requests. What is the difference between AWS Lambda at Edge and regular AWS Lambda functions? AWS Lambda at Edge is a service that allows you to run Lambda functions at the edge locations of the AWS CloudFront CDN service. These functions are designed for enhancing content delivery and security, while regular Lambda functions are executed in response to various events within AWS services. Can you customize the execution environment for AWS Lambda functions, such as the runtime or installed packages? No, AWS Lambda provides predefined execution environments for each runtime, and you cannot customize them. You can only include specific dependencies in your deployment package or use Lambda layers to manage common libraries. How can you automate the deployment of AWS Lambda functions and related resources? You can use infrastructure as code, IAC, tools like AWS CloudFormation, AWS SAM, or serverless frameworks like the Serverless framework to automate the provisioning and deployment of Lambda functions and related resources. Can you run Docker containers as AWS Lambda functions? No, AWS Lambda directly supports running functions as containers using Docker. Lambda functions are limited to running code provided as deployment packages in supported runtimes. However, AWS Fargate is a service that allows running containers in a serverless fashion. How can you ensure high availability for AWS Lambda functions? AWS Lambda is highly available by design, with built-in redundancy across multiple availability zones within an AWS region. To further ensure high availability, you can use aliases to route traffic between function versions and distribute incoming requests across multiple instances. What is the maximum number of executions per second that a single AWS Lambda function can handle? The maximum execution rate for a single AWS Lambda function varies depending on factors like the function's size and complexity, but it can handle thousands of executions per second. AWS scales out automatically to meet demand. How can you monitor and troubleshoot performance bottlenecks in an AWS Lambda function? You can use AWS CloudWatch to monitor and troubleshoot performance issues. CloudWatch provides metrics, logs, and alarms to help you identify bottlenecks. Additionally, you can use AWS X-Ray for tracing and analyzing function performance. Can you run AWS Lambda functions locally for testing and debugging? Yes, you can use the AWS SAM-CLI Serverless Application Model command line interface to run Lambda functions locally for testing and debugging. It provides a local development environment that mimics the AWS Lambda runtime. How does AWS Lambda handle function versioning and rollback in case of issues with a new deployment? AWS Lambda automatically versions your functions. If there is an issue with a new deployment, you can use aliases to route traffic back to a previous version, effectively rolling back to a working state. What is AWS Lambda at Edge and what are common use cases for it? AWS Lambda at Edge allows you to run Lambda functions at the edge locations of AWS CloudFront CDN. Common use cases include content customization, security enhancements, and optimization of content delivery. How does AWS Lambda pricing differ between regions and memory allocation settings? AWS Lambda pricing may vary slightly between AWS regions due to infrastructure costs. Pricing is primarily based on the amount of memory allocated to a function and the duration of its execution, with some additional charges for request volume, data transfer, and other services used. Can you invoke multiple Lambda functions simultaneously to achieve parallel processing? Yes, you can achieve parallel processing by invoking multiple Lambda functions in parallel, either through individual triggers or using services like AWS Step Functions to coordinate parallel execution. How can you ensure that AWS Lambda functions process events in order for a given event source, such as an SQS By default, AWS Lambda functions process events in parallel. To ensure order processing for event sources like an SQS you can set the batch size and maximum concurrent invocations configurations to control the number of messages processed concurrently. How can you secure sensitive information like API keys and secrets in your AWS Lambda functions? To secure sensitive information in AWS Lambda functions, you should use environment variables to store sensitive data securely. Leverage AWS Secrets Manager or AWS Systems Manager Parameter Store to manage secrets and keys. Implement IAM roles and policies to control access to sensitive resources and information. Can you update the code of an existing AWS Lambda function without changing its configuration or triggers? Yes, you can update the code of an existing Lambda function without changing its configuration or triggers. Simply update the deployment package or code inline in the Lambda function configuration. How does AWS Lambda handle cold starts and what is the impact on function performance? AWS Lambda mitigates cold starts by reusing execution environments for a period of time, depending on activity. Cold starts can affect the initial performance of a function, but subsequent invocations within the same environment are faster. What is the maximum duration for a single invocation of an AWS Lambda function, and how can you work around it for longer-running tasks? The maximum duration for a single invocation of an AWS Lambda function is 15 minutes. For longer-running tasks, you can split them into smaller tasks and use services like AWS Step Functions to coordinate the execution of multiple Lambda functions. How can you ensure that AWS Lambda functions are resilient to failures, and what error handling techniques can be used? To ensure resilience, you can use the following error handling techniques. Implement retries with an exponential back-off mechanism for transient errors. Use dead letter queues (DLQs) to capture and analyze failed events. Implement error handling and fault-tolerant code to gracefully handle exceptions. What is the AWS Lambda execution environment, and how does it affect your code? The AWS Lambda execution environment is a runtime environment provided by AWS for your function. It includes an operating system, language runtime, and resources. Your code should be designed to be stateless and not rely on long-term connections or storage since environments are short-lived. Can you share resources like databases and connections across multiple AWS Lambda functions, and what are the potential issues? You should avoid sharing resources like databases and connections across multiple AWS Lambda functions. Each function should have its own resources, as sharing can lead to contention, data corruption, and performance issues. What is the difference between AWS Lambda and AWS Batch, and when would you choose one over the other? AWS Lambda is designed for event-driven, short-lived functions, while AWS Batch is used for batch processing and running long-running jobs. You would choose AWS Lambda for tasks triggered by events and AWS Batch for batch processing or scheduled tasks. How can you version and manage AWS Lambda function configurations? AWS Lambda supports versioning and aliases. You can create multiple versions of a function and associate aliases with specific versions to manage configurations and perform safe deployments and rollbacks. Can AWS Lambda functions access the Internet or external services, and what considerations should be taken into account? Yes, AWS Lambda functions can access the Internet or external services. However, there are security considerations, including network isolation using virtual private cloud, VPC, configurations, and proper security groups to control outbound traffic. How does AWS Lambda handle function concurrency, and what are the implications of exceeding concurrency limits? AWS Lambda manages concurrency by automatically scaling the number of function instances in response to incoming events. When concurrency limits are exceeded, additional requests may be throttled or delayed until sufficient resources become available. It's important to understand and set appropriate concurrency limits for your functions to avoid throttling. Can AWS Lambda functions be used for real-time image or video processing tasks? Yes, AWS Lambda functions can be used for real-time image or video processing tasks when triggered by appropriate events. However, the execution time and resource requirements must be within Lambda's limits. For more resource-intensive tasks, you might consider using AWS Fargate or other services. What is the impact of using a higher memory allocation for an AWS Lambda function on its performance and cost? Increasing the memory allocation for an AWS Lambda function also increases its CPU power and network bandwidth, potentially improving performance. However, it may also increase the cost of execution because Lambda pricing is based on memory allocation. How can you schedule recurring AWS Lambda function invocations without using external triggers like CloudWatch events or API gateway? To schedule recurring Lambda function invocations without external triggers, you can set up a recurring event using Amazon CloudWatch events and configure it to trigger the Lambda function at your desired intervals. What are the considerations when selecting the timeout value for an AWS Lambda function? The timeout value for an AWS Lambda function should be carefully chosen to allow sufficient time for your function to complete its work, but not too long to avoid unnecessary charges. Consider the function's workload, potential cold starts, and typical execution time when setting the timeout. How does AWS Lambda handle versioning and aliasing, and what are their benefits? AWS Lambda provides versioning and aliasing to help manage function deployments. Versioning allows you to create immutable function versions, and aliases provide a consistent way to invoke functions without needing to change trigger configurations. This helps in safe deployments, rollback, and A/B testing. Can you use AWS Lambda to run tasks on a recurring schedule, like cron jobs, without relying on external triggers? Yes, you can use Amazon CloudWatch events with scheduled rules to invoke AWS Lambda functions on a recurring schedule similar to cron jobs. This allows you to automate tasks without external triggers. How can you optimize the cost of AWS Lambda functions while ensuring efficient performance? To optimize the cost of AWS Lambda functions, right-size memory allocation to balance cost and performance. Minimize function execution time by optimizing code. Remove unnecessary dependencies and libraries. Implement efficient error handling to avoid wasted executions. What is AWS Lambda layers and how can they be beneficial in managing dependencies? AWS Lambda layers are a distribution mechanism for sharing code and content between functions. They are beneficial for managing dependencies by allowing you to separate common libraries or resources from the function code, reducing the size of the deployment package and simplifying updates. How does AWS Lambda handle concurrent executions when your function exceeds its concurrency limit? When a Lambda function exceeds its concurrency limit, AWS Lambda automatically queues incoming events until resources become available. Requests that cannot be immediately executed are delayed or may be retried based on the retry behavior of the event source. How can you optimize AWS Lambda functions for cost efficiency? To optimize AWS Lambda functions for cost efficiency, set the appropriate memory allocation to balance cost and performance. Minimize the execution time of your functions. Clean up any temporary resources or connections at the end of your functions to reduce execution duration. Implement function-specific optimizations based on your use case. Can you have a VPC-enabled AWS Lambda function connect to resources outside of the VPC, like the public internet? Yes, you can have a VPC-enabled Lambda function connect to resources outside the VPC, including the public internet, by configuring an NAT gateway or NAT instance within the VPC to route outbound traffic. What is the maximum payload size for data sent between AWS Lambda and other AWS services like S3, DynamoDB, or SNS? The maximum payload size for data sent between AWS Lambda and other AWS services varies by the service and the specific operation being performed. It's important to consult the documentation for each service to determine the payload size limits. Can you have AWS Lambda functions trigger AWS step functions, and what is the benefit of doing so? Yes, AWS Lambda functions can trigger AWS step functions. The benefit is that you can create complex workflows by coordinating multiple Lambda functions and other AWS services using step functions. It allows for advanced orchestration and error handling in your serverless applications. How does AWS Lambda handle rollback in the event of a deployment failure or an issue with the new function version? AWS Lambda simplifies rollback by allowing you to use aliases. If a new function version has issues, you can reassign the alias to a previous version that worked correctly, effectively rolling back to a known good state. Can AWS Lambda functions be used to process data from IT devices, and what is the recommended architecture for such use cases? Yes, AWS Lambda functions are commonly used to process data from IoT devices. For IT data processing, it's recommended to use AWS OT Core, which can route data to Lambda functions, enabling real-time data processing and analysis. How can you monitor the performance and resource usage of AWS Lambda functions? You can monitor the performance and resource usage of AWS Lambda functions by using Amazon CloudWatch to collect and visualize metrics, enabling AWS CloudTrail to track API activity, implementing AWS X-Ray for detailed tracing and performance analysis, examining CloudWatch logs for function execution logs. What is the maximum number of concurrent executions allowed for AWS Lambda functions by default, and how can you increase this limit? By default, AWS Lambda allows 1,000 concurrent executions per account in most regions. To increase this limit, you can contact AWS support and request a limit increase based on your needs. Can you access and modify environment variables during the execution of an AWS Lambda function? Environment variables in AWS Lambda are read-only during function execution. They can be set when creating or updating a function, but they cannot be modified or accessed during execution. How can you ensure that your AWS Lambda function is highly available across AWS regions? To ensure high availability across AWS regions, you can deploy the same Lambda function in multiple regions and use Amazon Route 53 or Global Content Delivery Network, CDN, to route traffic to the nearest active region based on the user's location. How can you handle long-running or continuous tasks with AWS Lambda when the execution duration is limited to 15 minutes? For long-running or continuous tasks, you can use a combination of AWS services. You can split the task into smaller units and orchestrate them using AWS step functions, or you can consider using AWS Fargate, a container service that allows for longer execution times. What is the difference between synchronous and asynchronous invocation of AWS Lambda functions? Synchronous invocation implies that the caller waits for the function to complete and returns a response immediately. Asynchronous invocation means that the caller sends an event to the function and doesn't wait for the result. The function processes the event in the background. Can you use custom domains with AWS Lambda functions for hosting web applications? Yes, you can use Amazon API Gateway to create custom domains and manage APIs, which can be used to host web applications and route requests to AWS Lambda functions. This allows you to create serverless web applications with custom domains. What is the AWS Serverless Application Model, AWS SAM, and how does it simplify the development and deployment of AWS Lambda applications? AWS SAM is an open-source framework for building serverless applications. It simplifies the development and deployment of AWS Lambda applications by providing a simplified template language and CLI tools for defining serverless resources, making it easier to package, deploy, and manage your applications. How can you trigger an AWS Lambda function to run at a specific time without relying on external services like CloudWatch events? You can schedule an AWS Lambda function to run at a specific time by using an external scheduler, such as a cron job on an EC2 instance or a third-party scheduling service, which can invoke the Lambda function at the desired time. Can AWS Lambda functions be used to process real-time streaming data from services like Amazon Kinesis or Apache Kafka? Yes, AWS Lambda functions can process real-time streaming data from services like Amazon Kinesis. You can configure Lambda to process events from Kinesis streams or Kafka topics, enabling real-time data processing. How does AWS Lambda pricing work, and what factors can influence the cost of running Lambda functions? AWS Lambda pricing is based on the number of requests, the duration of function execution, and any additional charges for data transfer and other AWS services used. The cost of running Lambda functions is influenced by factors such as memory allocation, execution time, and the volume of requests. Can AWS Lambda functions access resources within an on-premises data center or a private network? Yes, AWS Lambda functions can access resources within an on-premises data center or a private network through AWS Direct Connect or a virtual private network (VPN) connection. You can set up VPC peering to securely access these resources. What is the idempotent property and why is it important when designing AWS Lambda functions for event-driven systems? The idempotent property means that an operation can be repeated multiple times without changing the result after the initial execution. It is important in event-driven systems to ensure that Lambda functions can safely process the same event multiple times without causing unintended side effects or data corruption. How can you handle version control for AWS Lambda functions when dealing with multiple developers or teams? To handle version control for AWS Lambda functions, you can use versioning and aliases to manage different function versions. Additionally, use source code repositories, example, Git, to collaboratively develop and maintain function code, following best practices for branching and merging. How can you ensure the security of data at rest when AWS Lambda functions interact with data stored in services like Amazon S3 or DynamoDB? To ensure the security of data at rest, you can configure server-side encryption on Amazon S3 buckets and DynamoDB tables. Implement appropriate access controls and policies to restrict access to data. Use AWS Identity and Access Management (IAM) rules to control what functions can access the data. What are the key differences between AWS Lambda and AWS EC2 instances for running code or applications? The key differences include: AWS Lambda is serverless, meaning you don't manage underlying infrastructure, while EC2 instances require management. Lambda is event-driven, whereas EC2 instances run continuously. Lambda scales automatically, while EC2 instances require manual scaling. Lambda bills per execution, whereas EC2 bills for reserved instances and running time. Can AWS Lambda functions be invoked by events outside of the AWS ecosystem, such as events from external applications or on-premises systems? Yes, AWS Lambda functions can be invoked by external events using AWS step functions, custom HTTP endpoints, or by setting up custom integrations or webhooks through services like Amazon API Gateway. How does AWS Lambda handle error reporting, and what tools are available for tracking and diagnosing errors in function executions? AWS Lambda provides error reporting through Amazon CloudWatch logs, which captures function execution logs. Additionally, AWS X-Ray can be used for distributed tracing and error diagnosis, allowing you to track the flow of requests and identify performance bottlenecks and errors. Can AWS Lambda functions be used for running background tasks, such as database cleanup, without an external trigger? Yes, AWS Lambda functions can run background tasks without an external trigger. You can use a recurring schedule provided by Amazon CloudWatch events to periodically invoke functions for tasks like database cleanup. How can you ensure that AWS Lambda functions have access to the latest version of external libraries and dependencies? To ensure that Lambda functions have access to the latest libraries and dependencies, include the necessary dependencies in the deployment package. Use AWS Lambda layers to manage common libraries and keep them up to date. Regularly update your deployment packages to include the latest dependencies. What is provision concurrency in AWS Lambda and when is it beneficial to use it? Provision concurrency allows you to pre-warm a specific number of function instances, which is beneficial when you need to ensure low latency execution for your function. It's useful for applications with consistent and predictable traffic patterns. Can AWS Lambda functions be used for real-time analysis and processing of data from IT devices, sensors, or logs? Yes, AWS Lambda functions are well-suited for real-time analysis and processing of data from IT devices, sensors, or logs. You can use event triggers or streaming services to process incoming data in real time and take appropriate actions. What is the maximum memory allocation available for AWS Lambda functions, and how does it impact their performance and cost? The maximum memory allocation for AWS Lambda functions is 3008 megabytes. Memory allocation affects both performance and cost. A higher memory allocation also provides more CPU power, potentially improving execution time, but it also increases the cost of function execution. How can you manage environment-specific configurations and secrets, example, database connection strings, in AWS Lambda functions? To manage environment-specific configurations and secrets in Lambda functions, use environment variables to store configuration data. Store secrets securely in AWS Secrets Manager or AWS Systems Manager Parameter Store. Implement IAM roles and policies to control access to secrets and resources.
Hey, if you like the content, please subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss a bite of Azure brilliance.